Hello and welcome to TMI with Aldous Tyler for Friday, September 27th, 2024. We made it to autumn, ladies and gentlemen, which you probably noticed over the last weekend. It was definitely summer on Saturday, and then Sunday, 20 degrees colder overnight. So for once, the calendar matched the seasons. What do you know? But it's always season to change things for the better, isn't it? Interestingly enough, when you look at the conservative end of things, they have a book, a very thick book that they've written for it. But because they tend to be very authoritarian in nature, Project 2025, well, first of all, it is based around the idea of them gaining, huge political power first and then implementing what they want to do from the top down. That's how they do things. But on the progressive end, as I'm sure you're aware, we're far more comfortable being a bit more individual in our approach. But we do have a book. It just came out about a week ago. It's called How We Win: Energizing Strategies, Voters, and Agendas. It's edited by several folks: Charles Derber, Susan Moodlier, Matt Nelson, Nancy Trevino. But one of the many sections of this wonderful work was put out by Ben Manski, longtime friend of the program. It's been a while for Ben coming on, but I'm happy to welcome you back, sir. Ben, welcome back to TMI.
Yeah, Aldous, it's great to be back with you. I wish I was back there in Wisconsin with you.
Well, I was about to say the last time you were on the program, we were actually in the studio downtown in Madison. So, but, I understand you're over at good old George Mason University and doing good work over there. I appreciate that. Now, what I wanted to make sure to quickly introduce about the book's concept is, again, it recognizes the fact that the best way for progressives to put forward a vision of the better progressive world is to make sure that each individual has the tools and the ideas that help build towards what we're looking to do as an individual. And so that's what this book seems to be aimed to do. Now, your section, if I'm seeing this correctly, is called Holding the Fort, Birthing a New World, or Why Labor Unions Matter. Now, the one thing I wanted to make sure to start off with, the title of that section itself caught my attention right away. Holding the Fort, Birthing a New World. So you want to make sure that whatever gains we have so far aren't lost.
Right. Yeah,
All
that's right. Yeah. And, those also, for some listeners, they'll especially those who are involved with the Solidarity Sing-Along, they'll recognize the reference to two old labor songs, Holding the Fort for We Are Coming, Union Folks Be Strong, right? And then Birthing a New World comes from the lyrics to Solidarity Forever. We can bring to birth a new world from the ashes of the old. So that's basically the idea that that unions have a role to play in both. That's really quite important. And the title of that chapter was actually supposed to be Why Unions Matter Even More Than You Might Think. Because obviously, working people understand why unions matter. But I make two arguments. And one of them is, I think, the more obvious one, and it's the one you started off with, which is that at a moment in which we're going into yet another election in which it seems quite possible that a minority of the voters will end up with an election that represents them rather than the voting majority. We've had, quite a few of those in our lifetimes, and in which it seems quite possible that we'll be dealing with, very significant turmoil over the counting of ballots and litigation and who actually takes the White House following Election Day in November. I make the argument that unions really matter for that struggle, and that that labor unions at this moment are perhaps best equipped to defend the republic, such as it is, against attempts to take away even the basic Republican rights to vote and to speak and so on. So that's a smaller argument that I make. The larger argument has to do with what happens beyond the elections in terms of making possible a new world, getting beyond this political and economic system that protects the very rich against the vast majority of us. It's called capitalism, and it's a system that that really makes democracy very difficult, if not impossible, to achieve a real democracy in this country. So there I focus on what I see as a pretty significant shift in the labor movement over the last generation towards it's a shift away from not just collective bargaining, and a shift away from sort of a focus on very narrow provision of services to members, what folks in the labor movement call business unionism or service unionism. It's not just a shift away from that and towards greater concern for all working people, aka social unionism, but it's also a shift more specifically towards worker ownership and community ownership, and labor unions actively not only allying with the cooperative movement in this country, but actually helping now to build it in very significant ways. And that is a quite radical shift in terms of what labor unions are now doing across the United States. And I think it's very important. So that's really what I write about. I also make an argument about the power of unions in today's society. And it's basically an argument that I'm making to my friend and mentor, Garl Perovitz, who is also a Wisconsin expat, although of many generations before us. And it's a running argument that he and I have been having. So if you'll forgive me for just running on here, I'll say a little more about it.
Go right ahead, Ben. Go right ahead.
Thank you. So Gar has a thesis that goes something like this. He says that because union membership has been in decline for so long, and because it has basically stabilized at around 10% of the formal workforce here in the United States, with a much lower percentage, somewhere around 6 to 7% of people working in the private sector, and a higher percentage in the public sector who are unionized. Because that's happened, what that means is that unions do not have the power to compel capitalists to come to the table and strike a bargain that we call social democracy, right? And Gar, I think, is correct in that thesis, right? He is. I think he's right about that fundamentally. So that's not where we disagree. And I also, but where I have a different emphasis has been to say that while it may be true that social democracy is off the table in the United States, at least for the foreseeable future, that doesn't mean that unions aren't really darn important for achieving all kinds of other things that we need to achieve, for other kinds of strategies, including a lot of strategies that Gar and many others, millions of people, are pursuing that have to do with building a new economy from the ground up, right?
Well, and I apologize, allow me to just interject for a moment and say that if indeed social democracy is the goal and it's not available yet, the fact is that's because, as with anything, we need to build the infrastructure to support it, which, as you're mentioning, then unions would be a notable tool towards that goal, correct?
Yeah, it would be, but that's the other part which I stopped myself from sharing before, and now I get to put on the table. As Gar and I are close, and so when I'm teasing him, I point out that 50 years ago he was arguing against social democracy, as not what we're actually after, right? So his concern in the 1960s and 1970s, one of his many concerns, was that in fighting for social democracy, we were actually undercutting the possibility of something much more democratic and much more needed in this country, which for him he calls the cooperative commonwealth or the pluralist commonwealth. It's the old vision of American socialism of the 1890s and early 1900s of worker and community ownership. And of course, there are some forms of social democracy that have a lot of elements of that. But social democracy, as we generally understand it in Europe, and actually the kind of social democracy that I believe the United States was headed towards in the 1970s, coming out of the 60s, is really a class compromise, right? It's what we used to call the safe, the social safety net. It's a lot of elements of a more democratic society, but it's not a genuine economic democracy in the way that that American socialism and radical democracy would have understood it in the 19th century. So the funny thing is that 60 years ago, Gar was saying unions are so powerful that they're making social democracy the only thing that people couldn't really imagine, short of some kind of violent, immediate revolution, which was also not what he was interested in. And now he's arguing that it's not possible. So that's our conversation. The point is, regardless of whether you would prefer social democracy to what we have, and I think Gar would prefer it, and I would prefer it as well. Probably most of the listeners would prefer that. I think he is largely correct that that social democracy, as we know it, was made possible through the strength of organized workers, forging that kind of compromise. So let's imagine that down the road, as you were saying, some other kind of hybrid, some kind of mixed system, elements of social democracy, but other things were possible. The question, as you said, is how do we get that? And you made this very interesting sort of opening, saying that Project 2025 was basically intended to be an instruction manual for reconstruction of American society from above, very undemocratically.
Right.
And that, I think, absolutely correct. And then you compared that with the progressive approach, which you characterize as being from below and something that was oriented towards individuals, freely being able to participate and take action.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, that's where I think unions are actually quite important because, unions do make us strong. Unions operating through public institutions like George Mason University or city government, county government, through school systems, through public hospitals, through public institutions, which tend to be more accountable, more democratic than national and global institutions. Unions acting through public institutions on behalf of the general public can help to make all kinds of next system reforms a reality in the here and now and lay the foundation for a new society that is quite different from the one in which we live today. So for example, unions are very actively building, are very actively supporting the construction of worker cooperatives in many different sectors of the economy, whether you're talking about in energy, whether you're talking about manufacturing, whether you're talking about care work in terms of childcare, custodial work, and so on. And that's significant. They have resources, they have expertise, they have they have a political economic analysis. You can see the effects of that kind of support from unions for this form of worker organization all across the country. Secondly, I made the reference earlier to unions in the public sector being particularly important. And the reason why I said that is that there are many places across the United States and actually across the global North, not just in the global South, where the public sector is actively backing worker and community ownership by using the resources, whether those are labor resources or the resources of capital, to provide very stable support for the building of new businesses and services that are, again, democratically owned and managed. So, places where that's been happening for a longer time in the United States in a very deliberate way include Cleveland, Ohio, where the Evergreen cooperatives are a model, or Dayton, Ohio, or Cincinnati, Ohio. Madison is held up as a model for this in many parts of the country, and also in a lot of the academic literature, with researchers comparing, various municipal governments and the ways in which they support or don't support worker and community ownership. And there are many other cities and counties that we can point to. And I would argue that it's not a coincidence that the places where this is happening the fastest and in the most significant way are places where unions are very actively involved in the politics and the policymaking of local governments and of our public institutions.
Yeah, absolutely. So, quick reminder for all of you listening out there, we are talking to Ben Manski. He's a contributor on this new book called How We Win: Emerging Strategies, Voters, and Agendas. And it can be found at routledge.com, the publisher website. That's spelled ROUTLEDGE.com. You can find it on Amazon too, if for some reason that was too tough. But if you go right to the publisher, I'm sure they'd appreciate it. Point is, though, that we have a collection here, not just of your work, but also of plenty of other folks, but it is all pointing towards the idea of putting in the hands, or the e-readers if necessary, of the individual people who want to see a better world for all of us, the concepts and the tools that they need in order to get there. Now, as you were pointing out, unions started off as pretty much a necessity because we were facing at that time robber baron capitalism, wherein basically you would have company towns where basically it was completely run top down. It was completely authoritarian, based on whoever owned the capital owned essentially everything, including pretty much the workers that owned their homes, owned their stores, all that kind of thing. Unions came together and had to exact some pretty harsh fought victories early on. And now, as you're saying, unions their purpose has evolved not only to include that, but also to now be foundational in making sure that cooperatives that are essentially started from the top down to be worker-owned, worker-run, that these things, come to be more and more. Now, with that in mind, would you say that there would be a way to adjust or evolve the union model to things that aren't necessarily directly involved in production, but in other areas of life?
So when you say other areas of life, what are you thinking of there?
Well, for example, I understand, as I ran a story about, I don't know, a month and a half ago, about folks in, I believe it was Minnesota, using some of the laws there to buy old trailer parks and things like that, but to have it then be collectively owned by the people who were then going to live there. And that to me seemed like very much kind of an offshoot of the union concept in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the idea, the collective organization to, increase the power of working people over the necessities of life, as you were saying. And there's different ways that we can do that at different times. And, when I said that this had been a radical shift in terms of the labor movement in the United States, it was a radical shift from the labor movement that I grew up in,
right?
But not a radical shift from the history of the labor movement in this country. So just to give you a specific personal example, like some people who are listening in, maybe driving right now, I was a worker owner at Union Cab. It was one of the best jobs I ever had. This job is actually another of the best jobs I ever had. But, and I went to our labor fed, South Central Federation of Labor, which I had worked with for many years and later was a delegate to the Fed. And I was interested in seeing whether Union Cab could affiliate with the local labor council, and was told that wasn't possible because we didn't engage in collective bargaining in the ways in which AFL-CIO unions, do, right? And there were a number of other experiences that I had personally, and there were many experiences that others of my generation had with the sort of official labor movement of the day. And these were people that I have great respect for. I worked with on, May Day and, all kinds of mobilizations and strikes. But it's just where the labor movement was at that point. That's changed, right? That's changed. Now, unions are actively, worker co-ops are sometimes represented in labor councils. I believe in Madison too, if I'm not mistaken. Now, as I said earlier, major unions are throwing down resources to build worker ownership and to build, other forms of community ownership. So that's a shift, and I think it's important. And there are many other examples of innovations in the labor movement in the last 20 to 30 years. And I will give credit where credit is due. It's due to whole generations of people who went into the labor movement in order to make it into what it has become of late. So arguably the labor movement and the union movement within the labor movement have become more powerful, in my view, that in the last 30 years, because even though the density, union density is down. That's to say, the percentage of American workers in the formal labor market has declined pretty significantly. What unions are doing and what they are has fundamentally changed, and unions are arguably much more powerful and much more dynamic and much more inclusive than they used to be. And so, that is something to celebrate.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And as you were saying, and this is kind of where I was going from, unions, even like I said, within our living memory, were very focused on being the resistance units within the overall capitalistic organizations that the workers were, stuck in otherwise. Whereas now they're being able to reimagine themselves to be applicable to a much broader array of solutions. Basically.
Yeah, unions really, helping to do what they can do best, which is to, lead the broader labor movement, which has always played a leadership role in the broader social movement, which is basically understood as the movement for the liberation of everyone everywhere.
Right.
That's really what a social movement is. And I do want to just say, I can't resist adding this, just that I think it's important for us to recognize that the history of unions in the United States goes back way, way back. The Continental Congress, if you ever go to Philadelphia, they met in Carpenter's Hall for years, and then they needed pricier digs when they were going to issue the National Declaration of Independence of these United States. And so they moved over to what became Independence Hall, but that was basically a union hall, and it's a great place to visit. You look at the 1820s in the United States, the first real socialist parties in the world, as far as I'm aware, were the working men's parties in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, and then later Boston, and those all came out of the labor movement and out of labor unions. And so, what does that tell us? So, well, in the 1770s. The sort of pre-labor, union formations of the guilds, the craft guilds, they were, cornerstones for the radical edge, the leading edge of a revolutionary movement that abolished a class. They abolished the aristocracy. It's the most radical thing about the Constitution of 1787. It's that it's so radical that we forget that it happened.
No more kings.
No more kings, no more aristocrats. They fled, and that's that's not insignificant. 1820s, they were building what we now call municipalist politics and fighting for cities and, best to say, communities against higher powers dominated by capital and by the slave power and so on of that era. So unions, I think what has happened is that the unions have recovered more of their purpose in this country, and it will all do better if we recognize that and find ways to embrace that and move it forward. As for the larger book in this project, another place people can find a copy of the text is by going to emergencyelection.org. And I think that says a lot about the mentality of the editors in assembling the cast of contributors. And there are quite a few people much more prominent than me who were among the contributors there. In that they really saw the need for something that speaks to what is happening immediately right now here in the United States to equip people with ideas and lessons from struggles that are happening at this moment so that we can collectively take action in the coming months to not only defend the Republic, but to make a real democracy possible in the U.S.
Absolutely. And so to that end, just to be really clear, some of the contributors you're talking about include Noam Chomsky. You may have heard of that one. There are a number of other folks, of course. You have the 4 editors, I believe, each have pieces in here of Charles Derber, Susan Mudler, Matt Nelson, Nancy Trevino, Angela Lang, Rachel O'Leary Carmona. Basically, there is definitely quite the list of what could be considered a bit of a who's who when it comes to leading thought and philosophy on how to make progressive concepts a reality, which is why I believe, sir, you are included. Now,
nice of you to say. It's fairly plural. It is. I mean, there's people who have different allegiances in terms of political parties. You have a U.S. Senator with Jeff Merkley. You have Maurice Mitchell from the Working Families Party, I obviously have a history with the Greens, among other things.
Little bit.
Bill Gibbon. One thing I did notice is that there are at least 4 of us who are Madisonians originally. So Chuck Collins is in there, and you also have Anat. Let's see, and Anat Shankar Osorio.
Oh yes,
the Madison West grads, and I think Chuck went to East. But we're all doing things. So one thing I'll say for Madison is it can be difficult for people to be able to stay if they're looking to be able to, Wisconsin's not a rich state, right? So in terms of, to accrue resources and be able to make a difference in the world, but we certainly export a lot of progressive change makers. I run into hundreds of Wisconsin activists in the DC area here who are still at it with unions and community organizations and nonprofit organizations. And we're all out here. We still have Wisconsin in our souls.
Absolutely. I mean, you go all the way back to Bob Lafayette and Lafayette, I should say, pardon me, and earlier, all the way on to the present day. Yeah, it's maybe it's the cheese. Cheese melts and flows. I don't know, but
the history of struggle is what it is.
Yes, indeed.
I would like to say I will fight for the cheese. I annoy people in talking about Wisconsin cheese. But no, it's the history of struggle, and it has to be maintained. As La Follette said, democracy is a life.
Well, I mean, it's one of those things where just from a purely scientific point of view, I have always thought that life itself is one of the most interesting things, because if you look at the majority of anything you can see on this planet, we would say, well, it's a lot of rock, a lot of sand, a lot of water, a lot of air, things that we couldn't consider necessarily alive unless you're going to get really deep in the philosophy. The point is, if you have life, you have to fight for it. You have to fight to keep it, because it's a temporary thing. It's a special thing. And that means that the fight for life includes the fight for making life better. And seems to me the way that unions work, not just on the worker union level, but this country itself was formed to be a better union. So, because the idea being is that if we all work together to make life better, we have much more power doing so.
That's right. Yeah, we have to look out for each other, and we have to be egalitarian.
Yes.
We have to respect each other's inherent worth, and that is really, I think, some of the best of the culture of this society.
Absolutely. All right. So again, ladies and gentlemen, this has been Ben Manski with us here. He's a contributor amongst many at the Routledge Press publication, How We Win, Emerging Strategies, Voters, and Agendas. Again, you can find it at routledge.com, ROUTLEDGE.com, or emergencyelection.com. You can check that out, as Ben helpfully pointed out earlier. At Amazon as well. I mean, again, we're not trying to make this difficult to find. We want to make sure that you can get a hold of this, whether it's e-reader, hardcover, paperback, what have you. But the important thing being is that we got to make sure that we have as much information out there to the individuals who want to make sure that we all do better.
Amen to that.
All right. Ben, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope that you continue on, and hope to see you back again soon.
You got it. I look forward to coming through, and take care.
You've been listening to TMI with Aldous Tyler. He'll be right back.